Thank you to everyone involved in organizing this symposium. A special thanks to Karen Ho and to Sarah Cronquist, and also thank you to the panelists. It's an honor to share this space with you. I also express my gratitude to the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we are meeting. It's a heartfelt thank you from someone who's very far from her ancestral home, Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, which is a place that is also hurting from a history of colonization, land privatization, and the Indian and Pakistani nation-making projects. My initial title for this talk emphasized Indigenous and Black racial geographies. But as I prepared the talk, I realized that focusing on geographies of resistance was a better frame to understand these two terms, Deep North and Deep South. Deep South is a term I'm sure everyone in this room has heard, and you might have some understanding or feeling of what it means. The general understanding of the Deep South is that it's a place that has been constructed by regional histories of enslavement of peoples of African descent, and by anti-Black exclusion and violence. Historians have started modifying this definition, that it is also a place constructed by histories of Indigenous expropriation and anti-Indian violence. Another way to put it is that in the history of the formation of this country, anti-Black and anti-Indian violence are entwined. We don't often think of it that way. I think it's important to grapple with why the former understanding of the Deep South readily comes to mind while the Indigenous side gets forgotten. Another understanding of the Deep South is that it's the former Cotton Belt states that in 1860-61 felt confident enough in their slave-based economies and societies to separate and form the Confederate States of America. The political leaders of the CSA and had a vision of building an empire of enslavement emanating from the southern Mississippi Valley and moving southward into Latin America, where chattel slavery had already been abolished, except in Cuba and Brazil. But generally, when people say Deep South, they mean Alabama and sometimes Mississippi. So who's heard of Deep North? Has anyone heard that phrase? Yeah, one person? 2? Okay. I heard this expression during the actions opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline to protect the lands and waters through which the pipeline was being built. They were also actions to protect the Lakota land base. Winona LaDuke, in interviews and in her own reporting from Standing Rock during the No DAPL actions, called North Dakota the Deep North. In an article for News from Indian Country, she wrote, "North Dakota did not become Alabama or the Deep North, as it is now called, overnight. Native people in North Dakota have been treated poorly for more than 100 years, whether by the damming of the Missouri and the flooding of millions of acres of tribal land, or by poverty and incarceration. North Dakota is a place of systemic and entrenched racism." So note the Alabama reference. When LaDuke says North Dakota, she wants you to think about what you know and you expect of Alabama. This isn't the first time the comparison has been made. It isn't some rhetoric coming out of nowhere. It's an analysis coming out of Indigenous experience. As part of a study on anti-Indian violence in the Great Lakes and Northern Plains, published in 2005, one of the people interviewed described a feeling of Native peoples having to know their place. The person said, "There's a kind of sense, places for Indians and non-Indians in the communities around here. There's an idea that Indians have a certain place, that there is a certain way that they are supposed to behave, and when they are on the communities. And like in the South, compared to this area, this is the Deep North, you know. The whole sense of maintaining one's place and one's position in society is the kind of feeling that Indian people get around here," end quote. At a 1999 protest in Rapid City, organized to draw attention to the failure of the state of South Dakota to investigate the murders of a number of Native persons, Mark Whitebull of Standing Rock likened the actions of state officials and institutions to that of the Deep South. He said, "The governor is not doing anything to stop this. Officials are failing to pursue these investigations aggressively. We live in a racist state, like in the Deep South." In addition to calling North Dakota the Deep North, LeDuc also called it flyover country, a phrase that emphasizes the primacy of coastal cities in the national consciousness and the invisibility of places like North Dakota. So not only are Indigenous peoples invisible in the national consciousness, a place where Indigenous populations are concentrated are also largely invisible. To call it the Deep North was an attempt to bring the region visibility when Energy Transfer Partners, a Texas-based corporation, was building a petroleum pipeline through Indigenous homelands and resettler farmlands, putting land, water, and sacred sites at risk. The use of Deep North, however, also insisted upon a broader understanding of the problems and difficulties Indigenous communities in the middle of the continent face in their homelands and beyond, and of the histories that had created those problems and difficulties. In the history of slavery, and in African American studies more broadly, there is an insistence not to just point fingers at the South. Yesterday, I talked about the Harvard and Slavery Research Project. That project very much comes out of that insistence. But the insistence is not new. It was right there in the midst of the civil rights movement. In one of his most well-known speeches titled "The Ballot or the Bullet," Malcolm, and I can't do justice to Malcolm X whatsoever, he said, "If you're Black, you were born in jail, in the North as well as the South. Stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. Don't call Governor Wallace a Dixie governor. Romney is a Dixie governor." George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, while George Romney, father of Mitt Romney, was then the governor of Michigan. Malcolm X's analysis also comes out of direct experience. He was born in Michigan. His father, Earl Little, a Baptist minister active in the Black nationalist Pan-Africanist movement led by Marcus Garvey, was murdered in Lansing. His father had received death threats from the Klan. Malcolm's family was ripped apart after his father's death, which took place in the midst of the Great Depression. Malcolm and his siblings were sent into foster care. Malcolm was well acquainted with northern racism. But then note the reference to the Canadian border. In times of difficulty, Americans like to imagine Canada as a place of safety, a place where they can flee if or when shit goes down in this country. You can see it in The Handmaid's Tale. You can see it with people like Michael Moore, for example, who love pointing to Canada and to Europe as havens, as a haven, a place where people are nice and they have health care. But in 1960, but if you consider Canada from an Indigenous perspective, it's no longer such a nice place. In 1963, this article was published in the Canadian national magazine, Maclean's. In that article, the journalist Peter Gazowski, in response to the murder of Alan Thomas of Saulteaux First Nation by a group of white farmers and businessmen, described West Central Saskatchewan as our Alabama. If you go back to this article, it is a terrible article, so the view that he's giving is this Saskatchewan white farmers are backward, as are Indigenous people, and everybody there has to change. This is the view he gives in that article. Very bad article. Nonetheless, here we have Alabama cropping up again. What put Alabama on the map globally and turned it into a metaphor for so many people? Black resistance. The willingness of Black youth to face violence in trying to desegregate educational institutions, the Montgomery bus boycott. But it was the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965 and Bloody Sunday that showed the world what white supremacist violence looks like. This photograph shows John Lewis, who was the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, getting beaten by an Alabama state trooper. It's important to remember, to keep in mind that this was taking place in the middle of anti-colonial movements going on in Asia and Africa and during the Cold War. This was a time the United States was representing itself as a leader of the free world. So when the federal government intervened to protect the marchers with National Guard troops, it had everything to do with the way the United States would be perceived by the decolonizing world. It was Black resistance that made the Deep South a visible geography, nationally and globally, and put pressure on the federal state to do something. The world was watching. Similarly, Indigenous resistance at Standing Rock made the Deep North visible, nationally and globally. I love this photograph. African-American scholar Charles Payne, in his book on the mobilizations in Greenwood, Mississippi, argues that an organizing tradition made the civil rights movement possible. It wasn't just a national movement organized through Black churches or through organizations like the NAACP. There was on-the-ground experience of local grassroots organizing, of folks putting life and limb on the line, that brought this movement together. Lakota scholar Nick Estes, in his forthcoming book, Our History is the Future, also points to what he refers to as the long tradition of Indigenous resistance. No DAPL was part of something bigger, part of a long history and insistence on Indigenous self-determinative rights and an expression of that power. So I want to spend the rest of this talk thinking about the historical connection between the Deep North and the Deep South. In my work, I use Deep North as an analytical framework to study Indigenous confinement, from reservations and reserves to boarding and residential schools, asylums and hospitals and prisons. The Deep North is today the leading incarcerator of Indigenous peoples in North America. While Indigenous incarceration has been acknowledged as a social crisis in Canada, it remains largely invisible in the United States. Not by folks who are affected, but by coastal folks in coastal universities who rarely look in this direction. In my work, the Deep North includes Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. It's also a cross-border region that includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. I argue that the Deep North is a post-Civil War formation. This region usually gets subsumed into the category of the West, the catch-all category for lands east of the Mississippi River. I also argue that anti-Black and anti-Indian violence have a common origin. I'm going to talk less about Canada. What's important to keep in mind about Canada is that it was federated after the Civil War, the US Civil War, and just like the United States, the West for Canada became a place of Indigenous expropriation and resource extraction that supported the industrialization of Canada, of the United States, and of Europe. So I'm going to begin here with some excerpts from a poem by Lakota poet Layli Long Soldier. She writes, "You may or may not have heard of the Dakota 38. If this is the first time you have heard of it, you might wonder, what is the Dakota 38? The Dakota 38 refers to 38 Dakota men who were executed by hanging under orders from President Abraham Lincoln. To date, this is the largest legal mass execution in US history. The hanging took place on December 26, 1862, the day after Christmas. This was the same week that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In the preceding sentence, I italicized "same week" for emphasis. There was a movie titled Lincoln about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was included in the film Lincoln. The hanging of the Dakota 38 was not. Without money, store credit, or rights to hunt beyond their 10-mile tract of land, Dakota people began to starve. Dakota people were starving. The Dakota people starved. In the preceding sentence, the word starved does not need italics for emphasis. One should read the Dakota people starved as straightforward and plainly stated fact. As a result, and without other options but to continue to starve, Dakota people retaliated. Dakota warriors organized, struck out, and killed settlers and traders. This revolt is called the Sioux Uprising. Eventually, the US cavalry came to Minnesota to confront the uprising. Over 1,000 Dakota people were sent to prison. As already mentioned, 38 Dakota men were subsequently hanged. This poem is much long, oh, wait, okay. Now, every year, a group called the Dakota 38 plus 2 riders conduct a memorial horse ride from Lower Brule, South Dakota to Mankato, Minnesota. The memorial riders travel 325 miles on horseback for 18 days, sometimes through sub-zero blizzards. They conclude their journey on December 26th, the day of the hanging. Memorials help us focus our memory on particular people or events. Often memorials come in the forms of plaques, statues, or gravestones. The memorial for the Dakota 38 is not an object inscribed with words, but an act. You can find the full poem in Layli Long Soldier's collection titled Whereas. I'm not sure how the execution of the Dakota 38 is taught in the Minnesota school system. I grew up on the East Coast in Massachusetts and Florida, where this history simply, whether in school or in college, this history simply wasn't taught. So in thinking about this history, I'm beginning at a seemingly odd place. In 1900, in London, the first PanAfrican Conference convened between July 23rd and 25th, was convened between July 23rd and 25th. As you can see from the announcement, the theme of the conference was the native races. Peoples from the African continent and from the Black diaspora attended that conference. Among the speakers was American scholar, literary author, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. There he made a speech where he said the thing that would most plague the 20th century globally was what he called the colored line. He said, in the metropolis of the modern world, in this, the closing year of the 19th century, there has been assembled a congress of men and women of African blood to deliberate solemnly upon the present situation and outlook of the darker races of mankind. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the question as to how far differences of race, which show themselves chiefly in the color of the skin and the texture of the hair, will hereafter be made a basis for denying to over half the world the right of sharing to utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. When he says the right of sharing to utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization, the question he is asking is if people of color around the world whose lands and labor built the modern world will be able to participate on an equal footing in that world. Fast forward to 1969, when Dakota scholar Vine Deloria Jr. published Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto. In that book, he included an essay called The Red and the Black, giving his perspective on the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. in that essay, he tells us the most feverish activity in America has been land speculation. Land has been the basis on which racial relations have been defined ever since the settlers first got off the boat. What Deloria says led me to question how, why, and when did race and land become analytically disarticulated, such that Deloria had to make this statement. He had to make this point. I think it has to do something to do with the preponderance of historical analysis of the American nation rather than historical analysis of American empire. The 14th Amendment, the very amendment that the current president is saying he will overturn with an executive order, didn't just make those born here on this territory citizens of a nation, but also citizens of an empire. And this map that I'm going to show you attests to that. This is an 1861 military map. It shows how the US military was, US Union military was visualizing the continent in 1861. The orange outlined territories here are called the Free States. The red are the border states, of which Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee seceded. Blue are labeled seceding states, yellow old territories, and green new territories. We know that the Civil War wasn't just fought in the South. The Union Army was all over the place fighting wars with indigenous peoples as well. Historical sociologist Barrington Moore, in an essay in 1966, called the American Civil War the last capitalist revolution. In it, he briefly discussed why the South thought it could go it alone. The South was confident in its cotton economy. But when Moore asked he also asked, why did the Northern industrialists no longer feel that they needed to be aligned with Southern planters? The answer Moore gives is that they formed an alliance with Western farmers who had been sending more and more grain and meat eastward. But these farmers and ranchers were also, Western farmers and ranchers were also sending food to the South. So the East-West alliance that is called the Union wasn't a natural alliance. It was a political relationship forged through a promise of property in land. Moore tells us the coalition, quote, the coalition did not become a political force until very late in the day. In the Republican platform of 1860 that helped to carry Lincoln to the White House, even though a majority of the country's voters opposed him. The rapprochement appears to have been the work of politicians and journalists rather than businessmen. The proposal to open Western lands for the smaller settlers provided a way that a party attached to the interest of those with property and education could use to attract a mass following, especially among urban workers. Before the Civil War, not too many Americans, aside from Black Americans who were enslaved, were fussed about ending slavery as they lived their day-to-day lives. A political deal was made with a promise to give away indigenous lands. This election poster shows that the East-West alliance depended on it. At the top, it says, "The Union must and shall be preserved." Under the representation of the eagle and flags is a banner that says free speech, free homes, free territory. In between the portraits of Lincoln of Illinois and his running mate Hamlin of Maine are two white farmers, men leaning on a shield that says protection to American industry. And blurred in the background are the smokestacks of a factory and the sails of a merchant ship. And so Lincoln wins on a platform of vote yourself a farm, vote yourself a tariff. The taking of indigenous lands was an election promise, and his mission to preserve the Union depended on it. This promise produced an expectation, and over time that expectation became sedimented as an entitlement. Lincoln opened up those lands in the midst of the war with the 1862 Homestead Act. Here's a song from that time called Uncle Sam's Farm. The chorus says, come along, make no delay. Come from every nation, come from every way. Our land is broad enough, don't be alarmed, for Uncle Sam is rich, enough to give us all a farm. So when Layli Long Soldier writes of the Dakota 38, and she's asking us to contend with Lincoln's legacy and what the Civil War meant for Indigenous peoples in the lands of this East-West alliance. The war was won through two strategies: the taking of Indigenous lands and lives, and declaring any enslaved person who made it over Union lines as contraband of war and therefore emancipated. The East-West alliance got Lincoln into office and able to fight the war. The North-South Alliance, however, would take a while longer to be re-established. And when it was, the deal that was brokered was the upholding of white supremacy north, south, and in every other direction on the basis of non-interference. Brown v. Board of Education broke that deal. And so the similarities of these two photographs, Standing Rock with police protecting a pipeline and Indigenous peoples protecting water, and the Selma to Montgomery March with police protecting white supremacy as marchers protect citizenship rights, the resemblance of these photos is not simply uncanny, there is a common history that binds them. And so the Deep South and the Deep North, Selma and Standing Rock, each with its traditions of resistance, I argue, are not as far from each other as we might have thought or expected. Thank you.